All right, like I said before, Chapter 8 has these three areas. First is the models of decision making, which we'll explore in detail in just a little bit. The idea of effective or ineffective decision makings, and then the effects of participation in decision making, something known as PDM. Like I said, we're going to look at each one of these concepts a little bit more closely. Also wanted to remind you that because this is a video recording, I know that you can pause it and write things down, so I will be going a little bit quickly. So, first is the models, and taking a look at these approaches. First were the rational models of decision making, and these are a little bit more consistent with those classical theories from the early chapters. Very logical, very cognitive. They were based on these normative ideas. In other words, what it ought to be. These norms, these pre-staged standards of stages. And these are the 5 stages of the typical rational stage model of communication or of decision making at this time. And a nice idea, but not necessarily very realistic, and certainly not pertinent to what actually occurred. So several alternatives to rational models were developed. Most specifically, this idea of optimizing, meaning the optimal is the ideal. That was the rational model. That's not realistic. Instead, what more frequently people will do in order to make a decision is just come up with something that will suffice. And so your book describes it as the satisficing versus the optimizing. That most decision-making practices within organizations are merely what is satisfactory, not what is optimal. And so it's a large difference. The other critique of the rational models is that it assumed a lot of rationality, when in reality, decision makers are not necessarily always logical. And the idea that decision making can be very intuitive. Now, when they talk about this notion of based on past experiences, that essentially is what we call analogical reasoning. That based on something that occurred previously, I'm going to make an analogy and assume, because of similarities, that this will be the outcome in this situation and this is the best decision. So it's not necessarily this rational approach, but it's important to understand that just because it's not entirely logical does not make it illogical. Okay, that's very important to understand. And Marsh came up with what he called the garbage can model, which is the idea that we have all these different things souped together and all dumped together in this big decision-making soup. And as when you have enough of these variables together, you make the best decision. And this last notion down here, that it's only after the fact that the decision-making process is even constructed. In other words, we throw it all together and we sort of see what sticks and what emerges to the surface. A very different approach to a rational model, and something that in practice actually occurs within organizations and within groups. Then we have what are called descriptive models. And descriptive models are those that describe the idea of phases. And of course we have Fisher's models and those particular stages, and you can go to the textbook for detail. The book also talks about the Poole's multiple sequence model, which had a variety of different decision paths that someone would make, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the models. So now let's take a look at some effective and ineffective small group decision making. And after looking at some of these stage models, these phase models that exist, that again are very normative and very rational, that brings us to when you look at ineffective and effective, one of the most significant variables that comes up, or at least that people tend to think of, is this notion of groupthink. And here you'll note a link on Squidoo that it's a pretty simple URL. You can look it up, and it's an interesting article that takes a look at this. However, I'm going to show you a little bit of a different link from a video on YouTube that highlights some of the notion of groupthink. And we'll see if we can get a grip on this. So look at this.
Yet another costly red faces all around space shuttle launch delay.
Why do group decisions sometimes result in monumental error? What drives groups to make decisions against their better judgment? Using the story of the Space Shuttle Challenger, this video explores the phenomenon of groupthink, in which group members seek unanimous agreement despite their own individual doubts.
Since Flight 17, we know something we didn't know before. The primary O-ring can fail completely. The shuttle has flown 19 times, and it's come back 19 times. Our job isn't to run around like Chicken Little hollering the sky is falling. It's to keep that shuttle flying.
Dr. James K. Esser identifies the 8 symptoms of groupthink.
When more of these symptoms are present, the likelihood is greater that groupthink has occurred, and therefore the probability is higher that any resulting decision will be unsuccessful, possibly even catastrophic.
The Air Force estimates 29 degrees at launch tomorrow morning.
We have no data on O-rings operating at temperatures this low.
So determining if this extreme cold will affect the O-rings, and if it does, how much is critical.
So our recommendation is not launching until the temperature is at least 53 degrees.
It's my understanding that the solid rocket boosters are qualified by contract for operation between 40 and 90 degrees. Are the solids qualified at 40 degrees or aren't they?
What you're saying sounds like Morton Thiokol is establishing new launch commit criteria the night before a launch. Now, these solid rocket boosters have been operating under very definite specifications. You suddenly want to change them. At that rate, it could be spring before the shuttle would fly. My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?
Our charts may be inconclusive, our data insufficient, but everything we do have shows we'll be safe for launching at 53 degrees or above.
That's clear. That's absolutely clear.
It's time to make a decision. Bob, take off your engineer's hat and put on your management hat.
Does anyone in the loop have a different position?
Even though we had some concerns about the low temperatures, we now recommend proceeding with the launch.
With this powerful video, viewers will learn how to avoid unwanted organizational actions by making decisions that truly reflect a team consensus.
Okay, now I know that in the last week you looked at the specific examples of the shuttle disasters in last week's, in terms of the the two shuttles, the case study is the word I'm looking for. So in that little video there, which is of course an advertisement for a longer video, that particular YouTube video illustrates a couple of the classic characteristics of groupthink. One of which is this idea of unanimity and this pressure and the idea of self-censorship and all these variables that show up in Janice's model. And there are 4 classic characteristics of groupthink. I don't have that written down here. They're clearly laid out in the book with the discussion from last week. That little video, I think it should be pretty clear what groupthink is. And it's something very real and something very dangerous. The other, in terms of ineffective decision making, the idea of extreme decisions, there's a tendency oftentimes in a group to be more extreme than people would on an individual level. Why is that? And the idea that these low quality decisions can be a result from a lot of different variables. These 3 that are listed here, flawed information, or these 3, improper assessment, flawed information, faulty reasoning, along with the variable of groupthink, help explain the majority of ineffective decision making. Another variable that influences the quality of the decision is the way in which you deal with things, the communication itself. Now, there are functional theories of group decision making, ways to be more effective, and some of these are clearly laid out. A lot of it has to do with brainstorming and coming up with all different alternatives and variables and possibilities, examining them, selecting the best, going back. Interesting research done more recently on the effectiveness of technology and how that tends to increase the odds of making an effective, good group decision. Typically, technology allows for greater participation amongst the members. There's a greater sense of equality that encourages participation, and decision quality typically rises. Now, in terms of at the closing section that you see here, beyond rational group processes, there are some critiques against this, and the idea that you can't rationally approach and dissect organizational or small group decision making, because those don't look at the context, and you can't take any decision making process out of its original context, and therefore the analysis is invalid. So interesting point of view in that chapter, in that section of the chapter. So going to the last section of the chapter, and that's this notion of PDMs, the effects of participation in decision making. And a couple of things. There are cognitive effects and there are behavioral effects. And cognitive, of course, is using the information. Behavioral effect more has to do with actual productivity. There are a lot of evidence for models specific toward participation and looking at participation. Affective models basically are making the argument that PDMs meet the employee's higher order needs, that their job satisfaction, think of Maslow's hierarchy, that those higher order needs are met when the employee is participating. In terms of cognitive models, that's based on a lot of the human resources, human relations paradigm, and it argues that PDMs improve the upwards and downward flow of information, and so it's more about the knowledge, it's more about the information, as well as the emotions. Think of affective as emotion-based, cognitive as like cognition, so the knowledge. In terms of participative applications and workplace democracy, participation in a democratic workplace is based on more than mere expediency about what's faster. It's based on the idea of the human ideals that we have about people should be treated. And here we have some research. You can read Siebel and Shea's as well as Collins' perspectives in their studies in this area. The last section in this particular part of the chapter is on knowledge management systems, and identifying and managing the intellectual assets of any organization become very important. It's the idea of converting this merely understood knowledge, the idea of tacit knowledge, and turning it into tangible, explicit knowledge. So basically, how do we codify this? How do we codify it to the point that some new intern that's hired in 13 years from now is going to be able to apply the things that we are learning today organizationally? So interesting research about how you handle this basically intellectual asset. How do you deal with this? And last thing I'd like to sort of put your attention to is, again, there's a chart on page 157 of the textbook that sort of summarizes the idea of decision-making processes, how these all work, along with the approaches that we've already looked at, the classical, the human resources, systems, and so on and so forth. So you might want to look at that chart again on 157. So again, the whole goal of decision-making organizationally is always to get to the idea of the most effective decision. So that's it for this lecture, and good luck on the projects in the remaining part of the chapter, and have a terrific week.